Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening for the start of our Parish Mission. Before we do that, just so we sort of stay awake, I thought it would be good in the Catholic tradition to stand up and sing a song to start our mission. So we will do that. Sing one that I think everybody knows, number 137 in the Missal, number 137. Lord, who through all these 40 days for us with fast and pray, teach us with you to mourn our sins and glorify you to say, as you with Satan did contend, and give the victory. Monsignor Lane was with us 2 years ago for our mission then. This year, the bishops of our country have launched what they call the Eucharistic Revival to focus on the Eucharist this year and next year with a Eucharistic Congress next year in Indianapolis, Indiana. And so we focus on the mystery of the Eucharist, what we do when we gather for the celebration of Mass, the sacrifice Christ made for us, and the eternal banquet that he calls us to. So it is with joy that I do welcome Monsignor Frank Lane, who was pastor here at St. Margaret's from 2002 to 2009. So he is my predecessor here. As many of you, of course, have known him through AM 820, St. Gabriel Radio as well. Since he was with us last, he has moved back here to Columbus. He is now living at the cathedral downtown with Bishop Fernandez, keeping him in line. They are good friends from Cincinnati when Monsignor was the spiritual director of my former theologate at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, and Father Fernandez was the academic dean there at the same time. Like the Energizer Bunny, he does not quit. He has now been assigned starting July 1st of this year, or July 11th, excuse me. He will become the administrator of 2 parishes in the central part of Columbus, St. John the Baptist Parish and Sacred Heart Parish. So he is going to get back in the thick of things as being the administrator of these 2 parishes starting in July. So as I was thinking, more power to you. Not an easy job. So again, God bless you in that. So again, it is my pleasure to welcome Monsignor Lane as we begin our parish mission here. So welcome. Another thing I did forget, right after this talk here this evening, we are going to have some refreshments over at Paul Hall right after this talk this evening that everybody is invited. Right?
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Saint Margaret of Cortona. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, I want to thank Father Jeff for inviting me back, for recycling me. And eventually you get to where you are no longer recyclable. And that will come soon enough. When we talked about this, he was interested, as he said in his introduction, that we kind of begin to look once again at the Eucharist, which is called really the source and summit of our faith. It is the foundation upon which the Catholic life rests. And it has, in our understanding of it, in our acceptance of it, has become, interestingly enough, ever since the 13th century, increasingly problematic. And it's become increasingly problematic because with the coming of the rationalism that came at that time, we kind of became flat earth people. Life and reality lacked a lot of dimensionality that it had in the earlier days of Christianity, especially in the patristic era of the Middle East. It was then something that it flattened out the meaning of it. That's the only way I could think to say it. And I've talked about that before here at St. Margaret's. And in order to do that, I know that we talked about, the new field of quantum physics and the whole relationship of time. And I mentioned, the film Interstellar, where they tried to play games and tried to figure out things about the bending of reality and time and all that. And all that is real, and all that is very much a part of new explorations. And it does have an impact, because what it does is it begins to restore to reality a deeper dimensionality than simply the surface time as a linear duration of measurement. And it lets us understand that time is much more complex than that, and much more interesting than that. And so it's not, we have very little distinction between, in our culture, between time and a yardstick. They're just both things you measure things with. Well, there is all sorts of reasons for us to move beyond that. In nature, in the New York Times, it said that, the New York Times, but it said that something like 60% of Catholics don't believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. Well, I don't know. First of all, you have to ask who are the Catholics that they took the survey from. Were they people who were simply Catholic in name, or were they practicing Catholics, people who believed and don't believe that? So it's really hard to say, but the question is, if we look around and we understand, in many ways, shapes, and forms, we have all sorts of meetings about, all sorts of, crisis meetings about, what do we do because, there's a mass exodus from the church, which there really is. If we had, 75% of our people going to Mass in 1955 and in 2023, we had 30% going, then there's something, there's an issue. There has to be more of this. There has to be a reason to be here. And those of you who are here have obviously found the reason. Those who are not here probably haven't found the reason because they've accepted the flat earth, the narrow, the shallow understanding of reality. And I think that, we'll get there. So I am going to go through the scriptural dimensions of the Eucharist. But first, I'd like to just maybe tell you personally how this came to me. And that is when I was very young, my dad was a Yankee Protestant, and his family was originally from New England, and they were and I have his Bible from his perfect attendance at Sunday school in the 8th grade. So, and his family was wonderful, and his mom and dad had a small farm. My grandma ran the farm, my grandpa took the bus into town to work in a factory. And so for us to go out there, and there's cows, and there's chickens, and there's fields, and there's a small lake, and there's a stream, it was just kind of like Shangri-La but we were always, in a way, it struck me, we were always visiting. My mom's family, which was Catholic, her father was deceased, but her mother had this great old 5-bedroom Victorian home. And that was kind of home base for us. Whenever we were away, we would come and that's where we'd stay. And there was always a crucifix on the wall. We always went to Mass on Sunday and on holy days and during Christmas and Easter. My grandmother always kind of sat in her chair and prayed the rosary, and there was a different dimension. It wasn't that I liked anybody better. There was a different dimension to the flow of life that went on in my Catholic family that did not go on in my Protestant family. Both were great people, and both loved us kids, and we loved them, all of this. But you realize that there's visiting and then there's home. What's the difference? And my dad left when I was 4 years old to go to the war, and so we went back and we lived with my mother's mother. And that flow was there. And I think part of it was my father's absent at 4 years old. You don't remember who he is, He's someone who's coming home someday. Unfortunately, he was one of the ones that did. But life was surrounded by things that I didn't understand. I could understand a cow, I could understand a chicken, I could understand a lake, I could understand a pasture. I could understand trees to climb in gardens and stuff. But there was something I didn't understand. And it wasn't that I resented it, I didn't spend long hours thinking about it, but there was just something mysterious about the life that we lived in comparison with the life around us. In my hometown, there was only 2 Catholic families, and we were one, and our next door neighbors were the other. And all the rest of them were Wesleyan Methodists. Again, very nice and very good people. But their life didn't have what our life had in my mind as a small boy. And so I thought, I wonder what it is that we're supposed to discover in life. We're supposed to, people seem at ease, people seem this seems to be normal. What's different about who we are and what we do? And I began to understand that it had something to do with our relationship with God. It wasn't that nobody else had a relationship with God. It was just they didn't have it in my world the way we had it. And I thought, I wonder what that is. And I wondered that all my life. And as a matter of fact, I went through high school, I think fairly normal. I went through college, I think fairly normal. Did all the things you do when you're in high school and college. But there was still that in the back of my mind, I wonder what it's all about. I just wonder what's really going on in this world. What I can see and touch is not the whole thing. There's something else. And I think that that's the thing that drew me. I always hesitate to tell my vocation story because it never is as good as everybody else's. That's something you already know. But basically, I think it was I want to find out. I want to find out what the mystery of life is all about. What is it at the very core of our existence that draws us beyond the ordinary? And I could find that nowhere except in the Catholic Church. And then I didn't even pretend to understand it, but I sensed it and I felt it. And I thought, there's something that I must pursue. There's something, I have a journey and I have to go on. How can you go through this without ever finding any substance to these questions? And so I became very curious about the faith. And one of the things that began to happen, I thought, maybe through learning. And to a certain extent, yeah, that was true. I had wonderful opportunities. We had a great scripture professor at St. Charles here at Columbus, and I had a great education at Innsbruck in Austria, at the university and so forth. And learning was a big part of it. But there was still something more. There was still something else. And I think that what happened eventually as I began to understand, there was a focal point within Catholicism that challenged not only my life, but challenged everything. It challenged the notion of reality. It challenged the notion of time. It challenged the notion of person. It challenged the notion of space. It did all of that. And that was the Eucharist. What is it? We say it's bread and wine, in the appearance of bread and wine, and it's the body and blood of Christ. What does that mean? How do we grasp that? And I'd like to read just a short passage. There's an author that I kind of am fond of. His name is Cortona, and he was back in the 40s and 50s. He was the head of Catholic Action in Italy. But he decided that he wanted to follow St. Charles de Foucault. I don't know if you know who Charles de Foucault is, but he was a French nobleman who was an adventurer and a soldier and all of that. And then he decided that there was something more. And eventually he ended up going into the desert, and he wanted in northern Africa, and he wanted to start a religious community and convert the locals. Well, he never got anybody to join him, and the locals killed him. But, interestingly enough, he left a body of writing and reflection. And after his death, a group did form, the Little Brothers of Jesus and the Little Sisters of Jesus. They're still among us. But Carlo Corretto decided that he was going to join that. And the novitiate, the training period for him, was they had to go by themselves into the Sahara Desert. And here's what he says. He says, to learn to live in the silences which are necessary, the novice master lets us go away for a few days to the desert. A hamper of bread, a few dates, some water, the Bible, a day's march, a cave. A priest celebrates Mass, and then he goes away, leaving in the cave on an altar stone the Eucharist. Thus, for a week, one remains alone with the Eucharist, exposed day and night. Silence in the desert, silence in the cave, silence in the Eucharist. No prayer is so difficult as the adoration of the Eucharist. One's whole natural strength rebels against it. One would prefer to carry stones in the sun, the senses, memory, imagination, all are repressed. Faith alone triumphs, and faith is hard, and it is dark, and it is stark. But nothing is more nourishing than this pure faith. The prayer in faith is real prayer. There is no pleasure in adoring the Eucharist, one novice used to say to me, but it is precisely this renunciation of all desire to satisfy the senses that makes prayer strong and real. One meets God beyond the senses, beyond the imagination, beyond nature. Corretto saw that it is the Eucharist that takes us beyond the flat earth and moves us into the multi-dimensionality of a reality which is incomprehensible and which humanity has always striven to unravel and strives to unravel it today in so many ways. Think about what was the spirit of the great explorers. You know, the English Calvinists came here and settled. The Catholic explorers sailed the world looking for gold. Didn't satisfy. They had been among spices. Didn't satisfy. They were always on the way. And so they went from the Caribbean to the south tip of South America, to the Philippines, to the Far East, to Goa, to South Africa, always searching. The difference between the settlements in this country, between the Spanish explorers and the English settlers, was precisely that. The Spaniards explored and the English settled. And I think that's interesting. The English were looking for what they found. The Spanish never could grasp exactly what it was they were searching for, and so they kept going and going and going. And so we then say, if Corretto is correct, and if we encounter God beyond the senses, beyond imagination, beyond nature in the Eucharist, then we have gone beyond anything we know. We know nature. We know our imaginations. We know all that. We know our senses. So what is he trying to tell us? And I think that takes us back to Revelation. What does God tell us about the Eucharist? What does he say to us in his word about the Eucharist? And I think, that so often we think that Revelation is somehow we're discovering God in Revelation. We can't, Jesus says no one goes to the Father but through the Son. We can't know who God is unless we know him through the Son. Because all we can know about him is what he tells us about himself. And what did we hear today in John's? The beginning was the Word. He tells us who he is through the Word. And who is the Word? He is with God. He is God. He is light. He takes on flesh. The Word is Jesus. So all we can know about God, Jesus tells us. So Revelation is not a body of information. It's a person. It's the person of Jesus Christ. And that we have the capacity to know him because he speaks to us about himself, and in so doing, he tells us also who we are. So let's see then what Revelation tells us about the body and the blood of the Lord. What does it say to us about it? And there are clues. It is an Old Testament concept, in all honesty. Without the Old Testament, it becomes magic. Which is exactly what the Reformation said, well, it's all just magic, it's superstition. And in this flat, rational world that emerged out of the Renaissance, what else could it be but magic? What is it? That's why Calvin, Luther, they couldn't comprehend it as Corretto describes it. They had to see it. It had to be rational. And so it became simply like us having a birthday party for somebody. We don't say, gee, they're going back and being reborn again. No, it's just a happy memory. 10 years ago this happened, or 80 years ago this happened, or whatever it is. But that's not what Scripture tells us about the Eucharist. And so a great entry point to the discussion is through the book of Deuteronomy, the 26th chapter, the 6th verse. It's called the Creed of Israel. And it's interesting because the Israelites knew in their culture, and it's not their culture alone, many of the ancient cultures before this imposition of the flat earth in the 13th century, that before that people knew there were mysterious and multi-dimensions to life, many of which they would never discover, some of which they would. But they said, and they knew, through word and through ritual, we are able to become present to the great events of our story, our salvation, our deliverance. Well, this defies this rational understanding of time. How do you become present to something that happened, 1,800 years ago? How do you become present to that? But the ancient peoples knew they could. In Israel, it was through word and ritual. In the Far East, it was through ancestry. In many places throughout the world, it was the rhythm of music. That's who the great and powerful people at the courts of the Irish kings were. They turned their law and their stories into music. And then that's how they remembered them. And when they would gather, they would remember them through the musical songs of their law and their story. Ancient peoples did this all over the world until the bright light of civilization kind of dulled the lamps of understanding and dulled the depths of the human mind and the human spirit. So what the Creed of Israel says is that on the Feast of First Fruit, you will gather together. You will gather some of the first fruits that you have. You'll place them in such a way, and then you will tell the story of how you got to this place. And the story goes, my father was a wandering Aramean in the desert. He went down into Egypt, and there he became a great people. Who is the father of Israel? It's Abraham, it's Isaac, it's Jacob, at least those three. But they went down into the land of Egypt in the 12th or 13th century BC. Abraham died around 2000 BC. So there's 700 years, and he's still their father. And then Jacob, even more so. He was at least 500 years before he went down into Egypt. And then they were there for 430 years. And then he came out of Egypt. What are they saying? What they're saying is this: they had this belief, and it's part of Judaism today, that the seat of life is blood. That's, for instance, what kosher meat is. You have to get the blood out of it because you don't want the life of an animal inside of yourself. And that, whether they still think that or not, it's at least the custom and it's where it comes from. Well, the same was true, but whose blood is in their veins? Their ancestors. We don't call it really blood, but how many of you have ever been on Ancestry.com DNA? How many have ever tried to look into that? What is your genetic story? Who are these people along the way? Who are they? How much of them are in you? How much do you know of what they do? Is there even such a thing as genetic memory? Nobody knows these things. But we have a fascination. Otherwise, you wouldn't have $1 billion industry of people looking for their DNA, of who they are, where they come from, who their ancestors were, what their ancestors did. It's part of human nature that has been repressed by modernity. At any rate, this is what they said, that as long as they are alive, and remember, when God made his covenant with Abraham, what did he tell Abraham? Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea. What does that mean? You're going to be immortal. That's immortality. You're going to live as long as you have descendants like that. You're going to live forever, because it's just going to keep getting more and more. And you know that in the Gospel of John, when Jesus debates with the Pharisees, and they say, we are the children of Abraham. And Jesus, interestingly, says, like, as children of Abraham, for these stones. Abraham believed what God told him. You don't. So what are you claiming him for? But they're claiming him because the blood of Abraham flows in the veins of his descendants. That's part of the Hebrew mentality. That's not this convoluted intellectual exercise. This is just, oh yeah, that's the way it is. And so, what happens then, through all of this, is that in the blood of Abraham, Israel is him. The Jewish biblical commentary says this: Abraham is Israel, Israel is Abraham. They're the same thing, because the blood of Abraham is in Israel, and therefore the blood of Israel is in Abraham. It's the seed of life, it's life. Their life is the life of Abraham, the life of Isaac, the life of Jacob. That's how it works. That's what they say. Now, this, however, challenges us in a way. It challenges us to say, well, how can someone from 2000 BC be wandering inside of us in 800 BC when we come out of Egypt? How is that possible? What about, hasn't a certain amount of time passed? If we measure it, if we take time and we measure it out in this flat world concept, it doesn't work. Can't do that. Genes are no genes, blood or no blood. You can't do that. Not in the mindset of modernity. So maybe there's something about our understanding of time which is deficient. Maybe it's something more than a measuring stick. Maybe time is a created entity. It is not a measurement. It exists. It's real. Have you ever thought, when we say, well, God is eternal, what do we think about when we say God is eternal? This endless series of moments. How long can infinity go on when it just keeps going on and on and on and on and on? But that's not what eternity is. Eternity is a moment outside of time. If time is a created entity, and God sees it from outside of itself, he sees the whole thing all at once because it's a being in front of him. We're the ones that have to progress through the territory to get from one end to the other. But in the eternal moment, it's just all there. You just look down and there it is, the whole thing. There is no progression of time in eternity. It's only a moment. We live in the created order of time. That phenomenon in biblical language is part of the quest and the search today in some of the highest levels of scientific exploration. I discovered this not too long ago. There's a great series of YouTube videos by a German scientist, Sabine Hasselfelder. And she is a quantum physicist at the University of Frankfurt Institute of Higher Physics. She's written a book, and the book, I wrote it down here if I could see it, Essential Existential Physics. But the big question she puts forth, does the past still exist? Well, if you check Genesis, the answer to that would be yeah, it does, because we can get there from here by doing what the Lord says, saying this and doing this. But she goes into the whole modern exploration of, does the universe have a consciousness? Is the past so real? Is the future really not yet? And she asks those questions. And she asks things as a physicist, and then she asks them also as a philosopher. And it's interesting. She tells really bad jokes, though, but she's very easy to understand. But it's just kind of fascinating. Can I follow? No. I didn't do very well in physics in college. It wasn't as interesting as it might be now. But at any rate, the world is beginning to understand that what has been in the very core of the Christian faith, from the very beginning, and in the very core of the Jewish faith since the days of Abraham, are legitimate contemporary questions. That all of the other kinds of things that all of the surface flat stuff that we are all concerned about, worried about, fine, we have to deal with the realities and practicalities of everyday life. But if you're going to ask the big questions, modernity doesn't have the answers. The big questions are rooted in the very core of the mystery of humanity and its source, which is the divine. And so when we find this then, and when we kind of discover this, and we began to understand then that somehow or other we have the key to the big questions, the modern world seeks it and searches for it. They use different things than we, different ways of doing it. I had a friend, fellow John Hughes Bamberger, who was a very bright guy who was an abbot of the Genesee for a long time. But he told me, he said, you know, how much theology do you read anymore? I said, well, not a whole lot. He said, and you don't do it because it's not very interesting anymore, is it? I said, unfortunately, I guess no, it's not. And he said, because now we have to move into the world of science, of physics. That's where the mystery is addressed today. The reality is deep in the scriptures, deep in Revelation, deep in the faith, deep in the signs of our faith. But we have to find it ourselves, and we don't have to be quantum physicists to do it. We have to simply be believers who seek understanding, and this is really important. We have to be humble, because we have to know that we don't have the answers. The answers lie in God alone, and that journey is the journey that Carlo Carrello was talking about. And I'm going to take some passages from Elizabeth and St. Elizabeth of the Trinity as well. She knows this too. Teresa of Lisieux did this. They all did this. They know it's a journey. into the depths of the mystery that surrounds us and that we are part of, but we do not grasp or understand outside of faith. And that then becomes the challenge. I cannot understand that there is a mystery if I never encounter a mystery in my life. If I am willing to accept the chatter of the modern world, whether it's Fox or CNN or NBC or ABC, it just goes on and on and on. And how much depth is there to it? How much understanding is it of the things that they say? Life, the world is a mess. There's no question. They talk about the mess all day long, so if you want to really get depressed, watch the news all day long. And you'll never recover. But that's not the issue. The issue goes beyond that. And so, in many places, unfortunately, our universities don't even do this very much. It takes specialists to begin to say, does the universe have a consciousness? How do we explore that? How do we find out? Is the past, does it still exist? A legitimate question. A legitimate question for the ancient peoples whose answer to that is yes, it does. And yet, we say, well then how? Well, in faith you can go back and you can say, well, in the 26th chapter, 6th verse of Deuteronomy, we begin to find out how the past becomes present. When we go to the Passover literature of the Old Testament, we begin to find out how the past still exists. And when we go to the Eucharist, we also begin to find out that the past still exists. And that's what we want to look at there, where we want to go in the rest of our mission. Because basically what we have before us is the justification for our ability to believe. It started in the 16th century with Erasmus of Rotterdam. It was not so sick of asking the questions that I can't answer. Let's just look at Jesus as an ethical, moral creature. That will be better. Then everything is morality. Everything can be black and white. We can argue about particulars, and there it all is. And that's all there is to it. Well, we have a lot of that today, too. But if we know that there is a mystery underlying whole reality, then even the moral questions take on a greater dimensionality. If, in fact, God is the creator and we believe that, then what in the world is abortion? If God is the creator, and I'm old and sick and I'm close to that, so you better do me in, because I'm a drag on society. What is that? What are all those strange questions, this strange behavior that we have? This whole idea of the machinations that go on in the world of trying to run upmanship even if it costs 100,000 lives. What is that? It's ignorance and it's darkness. And it's horrible. And it attacks the meaning of the human person, and it attacks the human spirit, and it denies the essential mysteriousness of what life is all about in the first place. And so, basically, as we then come to where we're going to look at the Eucharist, we have to keep this in mind. First of all, we're looking at a mystery that we cannot penetrate, as Cortona says, with our senses, our imagination, or the nature of the thing. We have to penetrate it beyond those things. We have to get beyond those things. And then if that's what it is, and that's the core of who we are and what we do, if that's the explanation of the mysteriousness of human life, then we have to, in many ways, and Father Jeff alluded to this in the very beginning, we have to refocus on the Eucharist. We have to move deeply into this mystery of the Eucharist. You know, it's really interesting that for the fathers of the Church, that the faith is what they called mysticism. Now, modern mysticism is not what they were talking about. There's a quote, sometimes ascribed to Cardinal Newman, sometimes ascribed to John Knox or to Ronald Knox, that mysticism is that which begins in the mist and ends in schism. To a certain extent, that's more contemporary. You know, what do you think of mysticism, visions, all of these kinds of things? But their whole meaning was different. Their whole meaning was this: underneath what we do and see and have, what's there? What is there? And Jesus gives us an insight into that. Because he says in John's Gospel, when they ask him who he is, he says, I am. I am in Hebrew is Yahweh, which is the name that God gave Moses in the burning bush. Jesus says, I was there. I am the mystery. I am the secret of the Old Testament. I am the foundation of the law and the prophets, because everything that is came to be through me. And I have been with you from the very beginning. I manifested myself historically in the Incarnation, but I have been with you through it all. I am, he says, over and over again. So tomorrow evening, what we're going to do is we're going to take Jesus at his word, I am, and we're going to see what that means in relationship, especially to John's Gospel, and his relationship with the Pharisees. How does he move into this mystery? And what tools does he give his disciples to discover and to uncover that which lies beneath the whole foundation of human existence? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace.